There was a photograph taken in 1986 on the roof of Reactor 3 at Chernobyl. It was taken by a photographer named Igor Kostin, who was one of the very few journalists who managed to document what was actually happening in the exclusion zone in the weeks and months after the explosion. The photograph shows men in improvised protective gear working on the roof. They are shoveling. At the bottom of the photograph, there are white streaks, irregular blurring lines running across the image. Those white streaks were not a problem with the camera. They were caused by the radiation itself. The radiation levels emanating from the roof were so high that they were exposing the film through the camera body before Kostin could even take the picture. He had to get the shot in an instant or the image would be ruined, not by poor technique but by the air around him. The men visible in that photograph are what the Soviet state called biorobots. That is the actual word they used. Not soldiers, not workers, not volunteers, biorobots, because the real robots had already failed. This week, on April 21st, 2026, some of the surviving liquidators, the men and women who were sent into Chernobyl in the months and years after April 26, 1986, to contain what the explosion had released, returned to the exclusion zone. They walked through the abandoned landscapes around the reactor site. Some came from the Poltava region of Ukraine. A former firefighter named Stanislav Tolomny said the experience of working at Chernobyl had shaped his entire life and remained the central fact of his identity 40 years later. They are old men now. Many of them are sick. Many of their colleagues are dead. And the full accounting of what their bodies absorbed and what the Soviet state did and did not tell them about what they were absorbing and what happened to them afterward, that accounting is still, 40 years later, incomplete, still contested, still, in meaningful ways, hidden. This is their story, and it deserves to be told in full. April 26, 1986 was a Saturday morning in the Soviet Union. At 1:23 a.m., Reactor 4 at the Vladimir Lenin nuclear power station near the city of Pripyat exploded during a safety test. The explosion was not a nuclear detonation. It was a steam explosion caused by a catastrophic power surge, followed immediately by a second, larger explosion that may have been a prompt criticality, a brief but devastating nuclear chain reaction. The roof of the reactor building was blown off. The reactor core was exposed to the open air. Burning graphite from the core was scattered across the roof of the adjacent buildings and onto the ground around the plant. The graphite was on fire. The core was on fire. And the fire and everything it was releasing into the atmosphere was invisible. The first people sent to Chernobyl were the firefighters. They arrived within minutes, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik. They had no radiation protection. They had no dosimeters capable of measuring what was actually around them. The dosimeters they carried only went up to 1,000 Röntgen per hour. And in some places on the roof and around the reactor, radiation levels were so high that the dosimeters simply went off the scale and stopped reading. The firefighters thought they were fighting an ordinary industrial fire. Several of them noted a metallic taste in their mouths and a sensation like sunburn on their skin. These are the first symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. They kept fighting the fire. By the time the fire on the roof was out, the men who had been on the roof were already receiving what would prove to be lethal doses of ionizing radiation. Pravik died 3 weeks later. He was 23 years old. In the days that followed, Soviet authorities evacuated the city of Pripyat. 49,000 people told they would be gone for 3 days who never came back, and began the process of understanding exactly what they were dealing with. What they were dealing with was not just a fire or even a destroyed reactor. They were dealing with an exposed, burning nuclear core sitting in the open air, pumping an invisible stream of radioactive material into the atmosphere over Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually across much of Europe. And beneath it, something potentially even worse was developing. The sheer weight of material that had been dropped on the reactor from helicopters in the first days, including 2,400 tons of lead, was pressing down on the hot reactor core against its concrete base. If the molten fuel burned through the concrete foundations and reached the water table beneath the building, there would be another explosion. Scientists described it as potentially exponentially more devastating than the first, an event that could render Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia uninhabitable for decades. That is not hyperbole written after the fact. That is what the scientists on the ground were telling the Soviet government in May 1986. A worker named Veniamin Pryanishnikov said later, "That was the most terrifying thing. We were petrified of meltdown, walking around like zombies. To prevent it, miners were summoned, coal miners from the mines of Donetsk, subway construction workers from Kiev. They were brought to Chernobyl and told to dig tunnels beneath the reactor foundation. The scientists feared that pneumatic drills would disturb the foundations. So the miners worked with hand tools in conditions where wearing full protective clothing was practically impossible in extraordinary fields of radioactivity underground beneath a burning nuclear reactor. To freeze the ground around the reactor, all of the liquid nitrogen in the Western Soviet Union was mobilized and sent to Chernobyl. When it did not arrive quickly enough, The plant director received a late-night telephone call from the minister in charge of the operation. "Find the nitrogen," he was told, "or you will be shot." On May 10th, the fire in the core finally subsided. The immediate worst-case scenario had been averted, for now, but the cleanup had barely begun. What still needed to happen, before any protective structure could be built over the reactor, was clearing the roof. The roofs of Reactor 3 and the buildings adjacent to Reactor 4 were covered in intensely radioactive debris, graphite blocks from the reactor core, fuel fragments, pieces of the reactor itself. This material needed to be removed before construction of the sarcophagus could begin. Radiation levels on the most contaminated sections of the roof reached 10,000 to 15,000 Röntgen per hour. The Soviet state brought in robots, actual machines, remote-controlled bulldozers called STR-1 vehicles, a robot called Mobot, German-made machines designated MF2 and MF3, which the West German government provided for exactly this purpose. And one by one, the robots failed. Ionizing radiation at those levels did not just damage human cells, it destroyed electronic circuitry, it fried sensors, it corrupted control systems. The STR-1 vehicles stopped responding to commands. The Mobot failed. The German MF2 and MF3 were described as simply not working. The most contaminated sections of the roof, the sections that most needed to be cleared, defeated every machine that was sent to clear them. And so the Soviet state made a decision. If the robots could not do it, people would. And the people they sent to do it would be called, officially, biorobots. General Nikolai Tarakanov oversaw the operation. The logic was mathematical and brutal. Scientists calculated the maximum dose a person could receive, and still, in theory, survive without immediate acute radiation syndrome. They set the exposure limit for the roof operation at 25 Röntgen. They calculated that the time a person could spend on the most contaminated section of the roof before reaching that limit was approximately 90 seconds. So the operation was organized around 90 seconds. Each biorobot would climb to the roof, shovel whatever debris was within reach into the damaged core or over the edge of the building, and then come back down. 90 seconds up, then down. The next man would go up, then the next, then the next. 3,128 men in total over the course of the summer of 1986, each spending their 90 seconds on a roof that the cameras could barely photograph without the film being destroyed by what was in the air. Their protective equipment was improvised. The Soviet military did not have uniforms designed to protect against this level of radiation because nothing in the history of human industrial activity had ever required uniforms designed for this level of radiation. Some biorobots wore lead aprons, sheets of lead just 2 to 4 millimeters thick, attached over ordinary cottonwork clothing. Lead stops gamma radiation imperfectly and stops it not at all at sufficient thicknesses over short distances. What those aprons provided was not adequate protection. What they provided was something for the men to wear that felt like protection, which is a different thing entirely. Protective clothing was discarded after each use, because the material itself became radioactive after 90 seconds on that roof. Each set of clothing went with each man. One use, then discarded, added to the growing inventory of contaminated material that Chernobyl was producing. And here's the part that constitutes the cover-up that your title names. The dose limit set for the roof operation was 25 Röntgen. Once a liquidator received 25 Röntgen, in the official record, they were supposed to be pulled from the work. They had reached their limit. But the demand for bodies to go up onto that roof was relentless, and the supply of men who had not yet officially reached 25 Röntgen was finite. So the dosimetry records were falsified. Men who had received far more than 25 Röntgen had their official records altered to show lower numbers. Men were given dosimeters that did not function at the radiation levels present on the roof. Devices that measured up to a certain threshold and simply stopped reading if the threshold was exceeded, leaving the men wearing them apparently within safe limits while absorbing doses the instrument could not register. Anatoly Zakharov, a plant worker who remained at the station until mid-afternoon on the day of the explosion, told interviewers that he was eventually hospitalized in Kiev. He was told he had absorbed 300 Röntgen of radiation. He said, "That's what they wrote down, but only God really knows what my dose was." That sentence, "That's what they wrote down, but only God really knows," is the sentence that defines the experience of the liquidators, not just the exposure itself, but the falsification of the record of the exposure. Because what the falsification did was not merely historical, it was consequential. The falsified dosimetry records became the official basis for determining what health effects the liquidators were entitled to claim as radiation-related. A man whose record said he had received 20 Röntgen could not credibly claim that his thyroid cancer, or his leukemia, or his cardiovascular disease was caused by radiation exposure at Chernobyl, not when the official record showed he had never received a dose high enough to cause those outcomes. The lie that protected the Soviet state's image in 1986 became the instrument that denied the liquidators compensation and medical care in the years and decades that followed. The Soviet authorities, and later the Russian state, developed a specific rhetorical strategy for managing the health claims of liquidators whose conditions could no longer be ignored. The strategy was to attribute deteriorating health not to radiation, but to lifestyle, alcoholism, heart disease from stress, the psychological effects of living in a contaminated zone, rather than the physical effects of radiation exposure itself. This is documented. It is not speculation. The same Wikipedia entry that describes the liquidators notes that even when liquidator health was declining so fast it could no longer be ignored, Soviet and later Russian government officials framed it as a health problem not related to radiation, but a result of personal lifestyle choices, placing the blame on the individuals rather than the institution that had sent them onto a radioactive roof with lead aprons sewn from sheets. It is one of the most cynical bureaucratic maneuvers of the 20th century. Use the men, falsify their records, and then, when their bodies fail, tell them it is their own fault. The numbers, even conservatively stated, are staggering. Between 600,000 and 800,000 people are officially recognized as liquidators. The number varies depending on which registry and which time period is used. The WHO puts the number of recovery workers called upon in 1986 and 1987 alone at 240,000. The average radiation dose recorded for those workers was 120 millisieverts, but the word recorded is the critical one because the dosimetry records were compromised from the beginning. One advocacy organization, the Chernobyl Union, reports that 90,000 of the 200,000 surviving liquidators have major long-term health problems. Chernobyl Children International, which has worked with affected communities for decades, states that 40,000 liquidators died within 1 decade of the accident, and a further 70,000 are now disabled. The official death toll attributed to Chernobyl, maintained by international agencies, remains 31. The 28 firefighters and plant workers who died of acute radiation syndrome in the weeks following the explosion, and 3 who died during the explosion itself. Other estimates range from 4,000 to 93,000. Some reach higher still. The gap between 31 and 90,000 is the gap between the official record and the lived reality of the people who were there. It is the gap that the falsified dosimeters helped create. Anatoly Zakharov received the Order of the Red Star for bravery in 1986. In 1992, 6 years later, he was declared a total invalid. That trajectory, from decorated hero to discarded invalid in 6 years, is the trajectory of the liquidator experience compressed into one life. Of his shift of 28 men who went out to fight the fire at Reactor 4 on the night of April 26, 1986, 28 men who responded to an alarm and drove their fire engines toward a reactor whose roof was on fire without knowing what a reactor roof on fire actually meant. Only 16 were still alive 20 years later when Zakharov was interviewed. He said, when asked whether the firefighters had known the risks they were taking, "Of course we knew. If we'd followed regulations, we would never have gone near the reactor. But it was a moral obligation, our duty. We were like kamikaze." They were like kamikaze. 60-year-old men who remember that sentence differently now than they did when they said it, now that they are in their 70s and 80s, returning to the exclusion zone this week for the 40th anniversary, walking through a landscape of abandoned buildings and overgrown streets, carrying in their bodies the permanent record of what they did there. Stanislav Tolumny, the firefighter from the Poltava region who returned to Chernobyl this week, said the experience shaped his life and remains central to his identity 40 years later. That is what it means to be a liquidator, not a chapter. A defining fact. The thing you did that made you who you are, and that also, in many cases, made you sick in ways that the state refused to recognize. The 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster falls on April 26, 2026, the day after tomorrow, as this video is published. This year, unlike previous anniversary years, there is an additional layer of complexity in how the disaster is being remembered, because the Chernobyl exclusion zone is now a war zone. In 2022, Russian forces occupied the Chernobyl plant for approximately a month during the early phase of the invasion of Ukraine. Russian soldiers dug trenches in the Red Forest, the strip of dead pines adjacent to the plant that received such concentrated radiation in 1986 that it turned red before dying. The Red Forest is one of the most radiologically contaminated pieces of ground on Earth. Russian soldiers dug trenches in it. They slept in it. They were exposed to radiation from decades-old contaminated soil that their movements stirred into the air. The new safe confinement, the enormous arch structure installed over the damaged reactor in 2016 at a cost of €5 billion, was briefly held by Russian forces, and remains at risk from the ongoing conflict in ways that Ukrainian authorities describe with deep concern. The liquidators who returned this week to the exclusion zone were returning not to the place it was in 1986 or even in 2016. They were returning to a place that has absorbed war on top of disaster, occupation on top of contamination, military trenches on top of radioactive ground. The landscape that received their sacrifice 40 years ago has continued to accumulate the consequences of decisions made by states that treated human beings as instruments. The biorobots shoveled for 90 seconds each so that a sarcophagus could be built over a reactor that was then threatened by tanks 40 years later. There is no clean ending to this story. There is no point at which the accounting is settled. The hiding that your title describes is not a single act. It is an ongoing institutional posture, a refusal, sustained across 4 decades and multiple successor states, to fully reckon with what was done to the men and women who were sent into Chernobyl. The falsified dosimetry records have never been fully corrected. The gap between official death tolls and actual health outcomes has never been honestly bridged. The claim that liquidator illness is primarily a function of lifestyle rather than radiation has never been formally and publicly abandoned by the states that advanced it. And the men themselves, those who survived, who returned to the exclusion zone this week as old men with complicated bodies and complicated memories, have been carrying that gap for 40 years. Igor Kostin's photograph, with the white streaks from the radiation, exists because he went to the roof and took it. The men in the photograph exist in the image as shapes, not faces. The conditions were too extreme for clear photography, the time too short for anything more than a captured moment. They picked up their shovels, they climbed to the roof, they had 90 seconds. They did what they went there to do, and then they came down, and their dosimeters recorded what the state decided they had absorbed, and the rest is a history that is still not fully told. 40 years on, in the week of the anniversary, with some of them walking back through the place where they worked, and some of them in graves, and some of them in hospital beds in Ukraine or Russia or Belarus, their story is not over. It is not archived. It is still unfolding in the bodies of the people who were there, in the families of the people who died, in the political systems that still have not provided a complete and honest account of what happened to the human beings they sent into Chernobyl with shovels. That accounting is owed. It has been owed for 40 years. And the fact that it is still not complete is the most important thing about this anniversary. If this kind of storytelling, real history, real people, told without softening the parts that are hard, is what brought you to this channel, please subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be told in full. I will see you in the next one.